For 24 years, a single mother named Monica Williams had protected her son from one painful truth. She had raised him alone, watched him graduate, watched him become a man, and learned to live with the belief that his father had chosen another life. Then, at a crowded family reunion in Atlanta, a billionaire walked through the backyard, looked across the room, and suddenly stopped breathing. He wasn't looking at Monica. He was staring at the young man standing beside her. The young man had no idea who he was, but the billionaire did. He walked closer, studying the face he had never seen in person but somehow recognized. Then his voice broke as he said, "Wait, that's my son." The laughter disappeared. Monica's hands began to shake. Her son turned toward her and asked the question she had spent more than 2 decades hoping she would never have to answer. "Mom, who is that man?" And what happened next would force a family to confront a secret that had survived for more than 20 years. Stories of unexpected biological family discoveries are real, and modern DNA testing has made it increasingly possible for people to uncover relatives and parentage they never knew about. Experts note that these discoveries can bring shock, grief, anger, confusion, and questions about identity and belonging. But this story is a dramatized narrative using fictional names and characters, inspired by the kinds of family discoveries documented in real life. Because before that reunion, before the billionaire arrived, and before those 4 words changed everything, there was a young woman who believed she had already made the hardest decision of her life. Her name was Monica Williams, and she had spent 24 years believing that keeping one secret was the only way she could protect her son. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what Monica didn't know was that the man she believed had forgotten them had spent years carrying a completely different version of the same story. And when those 2 versions finally collided at that family reunion, there would be nowhere left for either of them to hide. Number 2. Tease the mystery, 020 to 045. Earlier that same day, Monica Williams had no idea that the ordinary family reunion she had been preparing for would become the day her entire family history was questioned. Monica was a hard-working single mother who had spent most of her adult life putting her son first. She had worked long hours, paid bills that never seemed to stop coming, and made sacrifices Daniel Carter would only fully understand years later. Daniel was no longer a child. He was a grown man with a life of his own, and for the first time, Monica had decided to bring him to the reunion with her boyfriend. She thought the biggest challenge would be introducing Daniel to relatives who had never met him properly. She thought there might be uncomfortable questions, polite conversations, and maybe a few embarrassing family stories from Monica's past. What she could never have imagined was that a wealthy stranger would arrive at that same gathering, look at Daniel for only a few seconds, and recognize something in his face that Monica had spent 24 years trying to keep buried. And the strange part was that Daniel had never seen the man before. At least, that's what Monica believed. Because Daniel had spent his entire childhood hearing only fragments about his father. Monica had told him that his father was someone from her past, someone who had not been ready to accept the responsibility of raising a child. She never gave Daniel a detailed explanation. She never showed him recent photographs. She never encouraged him to search for the man. Whenever Daniel asked too many questions, Monica would gently change the subject. As he got older, he eventually stopped asking. He had learned that some questions made his mother uncomfortable, and he loved her too much to keep pushing. But that unanswered part of his life never completely disappeared. Research and documented cases show that unexpected discoveries about biological relatives can surface decades later through DNA testing, family records, or previously unknown connections, sometimes changing a person's understanding of their own identity overnight. Daniel simply had no reason to believe that his unanswered questions would walk into a family reunion wearing an expensive suit. The man who arrived that afternoon was Richard Carter. To everyone else, Richard was a powerful businessman whose name was recognized far beyond the small circle of people attending the reunion. He had built an enormous fortune over decades and had become the kind of man who rarely entered a room without people noticing. But Richard wasn't supposed to be there for Monica. He wasn't supposed to know Daniel. And according to everything Monica had believed for more than 2 decades, Richard had no idea that Daniel existed. That was what made the moment so difficult to understand. Why did Richard recognize Daniel almost immediately? Why did Monica become visibly nervous the second she saw Richard? And if Richard really was Daniel's biological father, how had a man who had spent decades building a fortune managed to live an entire lifetime without knowing he had a son? Those questions would soon have answers. But the truth began years before that reunion ever happened. And once that truth came out, Monica would have to explain something she had never been prepared to tell Daniel. Because there was a reason she had never searched for Richard. There was a reason she had never told Daniel the entire story. And there was a reason Richard believed he had already lost the most important person he had ever loved long before he even knew that person existed. Number 3. The woman who raised him. 0:45 to 1:15. For most of Daniel Carter's life, Monica Williams had been both parents. She was the one who woke him for school, packed his lunches, worked late shifts when money was tight, and somehow found enough energy to make sure her son never felt like he was missing anything. There were years when Monica worked 2 jobs, sometimes leaving before Daniel woke up and returning after he had gone to bed. She missed family vacations, postponed her own dreams, and learned how to stretch a paycheck farther than it was ever supposed to go. Daniel noticed those sacrifices even when Monica tried to hide them. As he grew older, he became the kind of man she hoped he would become: respectful, dependable, hardworking, and protective of the people he loved. But there was one subject Daniel could never completely understand: his father. Whenever he asked, Monica always gave him the same answer: "Your father wasn't ready to be a father." Eventually, Daniel stopped asking. He accepted that explanation because he trusted his mother. What he didn't know was that Monica's story had left out the most important part. Years earlier, before Monica became the woman Daniel knew as his mother, she had been involved with a young businessman named Richard Carter. Richard wasn't yet the billionaire everyone would eventually know. He was ambitious, confident, and determined to build something of his own. Monica met him when neither of them could have imagined where their lives would eventually lead. Their relationship became serious, and for a while, Monica believed Richard might be the man she would spend her life with. Then everything changed. Their relationship ended after a painful misunderstanding, and neither of them understood what the other was thinking. Monica believed Richard had walked away from her. Richard believed Monica had chosen to disappear. Years later, documented cases have shown that children can grow up without knowing a biological parent because of misunderstandings, adoption circumstances, or information that was never shared. In one ABC News case, a man named Tom Nuvman discovered through an ancestry DNA match that he had a biological son he had never known about for 50 years. He had previously believed a past relationship had simply ended without him knowing the child existed. Monica's situation had one crucial difference. She knew Daniel was Richard's son. Richard didn't. When Monica discovered she was pregnant, she was frightened and alone. She tried to contact Richard, but the conversation she expected never happened. Messages went unanswered. Calls never connected. And then Monica received information that convinced her Richard wanted nothing to do with her or the baby. She didn't know that Richard had received a completely different story. He was led to believe Monica had moved on and wanted nothing more to do with him. Richard was young, angry, and too proud to keep chasing someone he believed had already rejected him. So he walked away. Monica did the same. Neither understood that the silence between them had been built on information that was incomplete. And while Richard went on to build companies, acquire properties, and eventually become one of the wealthiest men in America, Monica built a different kind of fortune. She built a life for Daniel. She didn't have millions. She didn't have private jets or luxury homes. She had determination. She had long nights. She had unpaid bills and worn-out shoes. And she had a little boy who depended on her. So Monica made a decision that would shape all 3 of their lives. She would raise Daniel herself. She would never make him feel unwanted. And she would never tell him that the man he believed had abandoned him was actually a man who didn't even know he had a son. For 24 years, Monica carried that truth alone, until the day Richard Carter walked into her family's reunion. And the moment he looked at Daniel, Monica knew the secret she had protected for more than 2 decades was about to come crashing into the open. Number 4. The secret that was never told. 1:15 to 1:50. A few weeks after Monica Williams and Richard Carter separated, Monica discovered she was pregnant. She was young, frightened, and completely unprepared for what was coming. But despite the fear, there was one thing she knew with certainty. Daniel Carter was Richard's child. Monica tried to contact Richard because she believed he deserved to know. She called the number she had. She left messages. She tried reaching people connected to him. But none of those attempts produced the answer she was hoping for. Instead, Monica received a message that changed everything. Richard's family told her that Richard wanted nothing to do with her anymore. They said he had moved on and didn't want to reopen the relationship. To Monica, those words were devastating. She had already been hurt by the breakup, but hearing that Richard supposedly wanted nothing to do with his own child made the situation even more painful. She couldn't understand how someone she had once loved could seemingly turn away so easily. But what Monica didn't know was that Richard had never been given the complete truth. The people around Richard had their own version of what happened. Richard was told that Monica had chosen to leave and had no intention of returning. He didn't know she was pregnant. He didn't know she had tried to reach him. And most importantly, he never knew there was a child whose entire future was being shaped by the misunderstanding between them. Monica eventually stopped trying. She didn't want Daniel growing up watching his mother beg someone to care about him. So she made a decision that was painful but, in her mind, necessary. She would raise her son without Richard. She would never ask Richard for money. She would never chase his family. And she would never allow Daniel to believe that his worth depended on whether his father wanted him. Years passed. Richard's business grew from a small ambition into an enormous empire. His name became associated with wealth, influence, and success. He acquired companies, built a fortune, and became the kind of billionaire whose life seemed completely removed from the world Monica and Daniel lived in. Yet throughout all those years, Richard remained completely unaware that somewhere in America, a young man carrying his blood was growing up. Daniel knew almost nothing about his father. Monica had only one old photograph from the years before everything fell apart. It showed Richard when he was much younger, before the money, before the headlines, before the enormous success. Daniel had seen that photograph so many times that the face had become familiar even though the man himself was a stranger. Sometimes Daniel wondered where his father was. Sometimes he wondered whether his father ever thought about him. But Monica always encouraged him to focus on the life they had built together. So Daniel did exactly that. Then came the family reunion. Daniel arrived beside Monica, completely unaware of what was about to happen. He greeted relatives, shook hands, smiled for photographs, and walked through the backyard as if it were an ordinary afternoon. He had no idea that somewhere nearby was the man from that old photograph. He had no idea that Richard Carter, the billionaire he had never met, was standing only a few yards away. And he certainly didn't know that when Richard finally looked across that crowded backyard and saw Daniel's face, he wouldn't see a stranger. He would see himself, the eyes, the expression, the unmistakable family resemblance. Richard stared at Daniel for several seconds. Then he looked at Monica. And in that instant, 24 years of unanswered questions suddenly became impossible to ignore. Number 5. The moment everything changes, 150 to 225. For Richard Carter, the family reunion had been nothing more than an invitation he almost didn't accept. He had arrived expecting to spend a few hours with people he hadn't seen in years, shake a few hands, exchange polite greetings, and leave before the afternoon became too long. Then he saw Daniel Carter. At first, Richard couldn't explain why the young man's face had caught his attention. There was something familiar about him, but Richard couldn't place it. He watched Daniel laugh with one of the relatives, and then he noticed the eyes. They were the same deep-set eyes Richard remembered seeing every morning when he looked in the mirror as a young man. Then Daniel smiled. Richard's expression changed. That smile was almost identical to the one his own father had carried in old family photographs. But there was one more detail that made Richard's heart begin to race. A small scar near Daniel's eyebrow. Richard had the same mark from an accident he suffered as a child. Richard didn't know what to think. He watched Daniel for another moment before finally walking toward him. Daniel noticed the older man approaching and assumed he was simply another family friend. Richard stopped a few feet away and asked a question that seemed completely ordinary. "What's your mother's name?" Daniel looked at him with mild confusion. Then he answered, "Monica Williams." Richard froze. The noise around him seemed to disappear. He slowly turned his head toward Monica. She was standing several feet away, and the moment their eyes met, Richard knew. Monica's face had gone pale. She didn't need to hear the question. She didn't need an explanation. She knew Richard had finally connected the pieces. Richard turned back toward Daniel. How old are you? Daniel answered. Richard stared at him. 24. The number seemed to hit him harder than anything else. 24 years. 24 birthdays. 24 Christmases. 24 years of a life Richard had never known existed. Richard reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. His hands were beginning to shake as he searched through old photographs stored on the device. He scrolled past pictures of business meetings, family gatherings, and younger versions of himself until he found an old photograph from decades earlier. He looked at the photograph. Then he looked at Daniel. Then back at the photograph. The resemblance wasn't subtle anymore. It was overwhelming. Richard slowly raised his eyes toward Daniel. His voice became almost a whisper. You have your grandfather's eyes. Daniel didn't understand, but the people standing nearby did. They began looking between Richard and Daniel. Then at Monica. The family reunion that had been filled with laughter only minutes earlier had become completely silent. Because everyone was beginning to understand what Richard had just discovered. This wasn't a random resemblance. This wasn't a coincidence. Richard Carter had just found the son he never knew he had. And Monica Williams was standing there, watching 24 years of silence collapse in front of everyone. Number 6. The DNA question, 2:25 to 3 o'clock. Daniel Carter looked from Richard Carter to Monica Williams, trying to understand why everyone around him had suddenly become silent. A few minutes earlier, he had been talking and laughing with relatives he hadn't seen in months. Now the man standing in front of him was claiming something that could change everything Daniel thought he knew about his own life. Daniel looked directly at his mother and finally asked the question that Monica had spent 24 years trying to avoid. Mom, what is he talking about? Monica didn't answer immediately. Her eyes filled with tears, and for several seconds she simply stood there, unable to find the words. Daniel asked again, this time more firmly. Mom, who is Richard Carter? Monica finally looked at Richard, then back at her son. Her voice trembled as she admitted the truth. Richard Carter was Daniel's biological father. Daniel stared at her as though he had heard something impossible. The man he had spent his entire life believing had abandoned him was standing only a few feet away. And now he was a billionaire. Daniel had questions that couldn't be answered in a single conversation. Why had Richard never contacted him? Why had Monica never told him the truth? And why had Richard looked at him as if he had just discovered the most important person in his life? Monica explained that she had tried to contact Richard years ago. She had sent messages and made attempts to reach him, but she had eventually been told that Richard wanted nothing to do with her. She believed him. She believed Richard had chosen to walk away from them. But Richard's expression changed when he heard that. He told Monica he had never received those messages. He had spent decades believing that Monica had disappeared because she wanted nothing more to do with him. For the first time, both of them realized the painful truth. They had been living with completely different versions of the same story. Monica thought Richard had abandoned her. Richard thought Monica had abandoned him. And between those two misunderstandings was a child who had grown into a man without knowing either side of the truth. Daniel looked at Richard again. The billionaire who had just called him his son suddenly seemed less like a powerful businessman and more like a father who had lost 24 years without even knowing he had lost them. But Richard wasn't satisfied with assumptions. He wanted proof. He wanted answers that nobody could argue with. So he asked Daniel if he would take a DNA test. Daniel agreed. And suddenly, the family reunion wasn't about food, laughter, or old memories anymore. It was about a missing father, a forgotten son, a mother carrying a secret, and a DNA test that could finally prove whether Richard Carter had really found the son he had never known existed. Number 7. The reveal, 3 to 3:35. The days that followed the family reunion were filled with uncertainty. Daniel Carter had agreed to the DNA test, but agreeing to take it didn't mean he was ready for what the results might say. For 24 years, Daniel had lived with one version of his family history. Monica Williams was his mother. His father was a man who, according to everything Daniel had been told, had chosen not to be part of his life. Now Richard Carter had entered that story, claiming to be the father Daniel had never known. Richard didn't pressure Daniel for an answer. He didn't try to convince him with his wealth. He simply waited. Days later, the results arrived. Richard opened them with Daniel present. The confirmation was clear. Richard Carter was Daniel's biological father. For a man who had spent decades building businesses, making billions, and becoming one of the most powerful people in his world, Richard suddenly understood that none of his accomplishments could change what mattered most. He could buy houses Daniel never lived in. He could buy cars Daniel never drove. He could build a future filled with opportunities. But he couldn't buy back Daniel's first birthday. He couldn't return to the school events he missed, the holidays he never attended, the difficult nights when Monica had to handle everything alone, or the years when Daniel wondered what kind of man his father was. 24 years had passed without either of them knowing the other was out there. Richard looked at Daniel. There was no business deal to negotiate, no contract to sign, no amount of money that could make the past disappear. So Richard didn't offer Daniel a fortune. He asked him something much more difficult. Is it too late for me to be your father? Daniel said nothing. He didn't smile. He didn't step forward. He simply looked at Richard. Because a DNA test could prove that Richard was his father. But it couldn't instantly create 24 years of memories. And Daniel had to decide whether the man standing in front of him was finally ready to become the father he had spent his entire life wondering about. Number 8. Final emotional payoff, 335 to 355. Richard Carter understood that the DNA test had answered one question, but it couldn't erase 24 years of absence. So he didn't try to explain away the past, and he didn't pretend that money could fix everything. He looked at Daniel Carter and spoke with the humility of a man who finally understood what his wealth could never accomplish. I can't give you back your childhood, but if you'll let me, I'd like to be there for whatever comes next. Daniel remained quiet. For years, he had wondered what it would feel like to finally meet the father whose face existed only in an old photograph. Now that man was standing directly in front of him. Daniel turned toward Monica Williams. She had spent 24 years protecting him, carrying a secret she believed was necessary to keep his life stable. Monica looked at her son, and after everything that had happened, she simply nodded. Daniel slowly turned back toward Richard. He didn't suddenly forget the past. He didn't pretend the unanswered questions no longer mattered. But he understood that this moment was about what could happen next. Daniel extended his hand. Richard looked down at it for a moment before taking it firmly in his own. And for the first time, the two men stood together not as a billionaire and a stranger, but as father and son. Richard had spent decades building an empire that money could measure. But standing there with Daniel, he finally understood that the greatest thing he had ever gained wasn't another company, another property, or another $1 billion. It was the son he never knew he had. And Monica Williams, the woman who had carried the weight of that secret for 24 years, finally watched the two people connected by the truth stand together. The past could not be rewritten, but maybe the future could still be different. Number 9. Final CTA, 3:55 to 4 o'clock. Richard Carter had spent years building a fortune most people could only imagine, but none of it could give him back the 24 years he had lost with Daniel Carter. Monica Williams had spent those same years raising her son, protecting him, and carrying a secret she believed would spare him from more pain. Now the truth was finally out, and father and son had a chance to build something neither of them ever thought they would have. But this story leaves one question behind. If you discovered your father was a billionaire after all those years, would you forgive him, or would you walk away? Tell us what you would do in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more unforgettable stories.